Introducing you to people across North Carolina and around the world who put their Catholic faith into action. This is FaithWorks on Catholic 540 AM Divine Mercy Radio. Now, here's your host for FaithWorks, Ellen White.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of FaithWorks on Divine Mercy Radio. Our show highlights individuals through God's grace who put their faith into action daily. Amazing people who have an interesting, sometimes overlooked impact on our Catholic faith. On FaithWorks, we share their stories. I'm your host, Ellen White. Welcome to Saints in the Making, where we explore the lives of holy men and women who continue to inspire us on our journey of faith. This month, we're turning our attention to three powerful witnesses in the life of the Church, all of whom we celebrate in the month of November. From the tireless mission work of Mother Cabrini to the royal charity of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary and the apostolic leadership of Saint Clement of Rome, each of these saints show us what it means to live with courage, compassion, and conviction. Their lives remind us that holiness is not reserved for the few. It's a call for all of us. Let's take a closer look at their stories, the virtues they embodied, and the legacy they leave behind for the Church today. Our guest today, as always, is Rob Agnelli, who's here to help us unpack their stories, not just to admire them, but to discover what they can teach us about becoming saints ourselves. Welcome back, Rob.
Good to be here.
Okay. And, I had so many thoughts going through my head as we're doing this introduction and thinking about, with the month of November and All Saints, the saints that have gone before us, all the saints that we recognize. And there's a tradition that I started a couple of years ago where I will put pictures of family members and friends that have passed on the mantle. And I love that because it's a reminder of, there are people that have gone before us that, Lord willing, have lived their faith.
Yeah,
well.
the cloud of witnesses.
Yes, exactly. So let's begin with the life of Mother Cabrini, whose feast day we celebrate on November 13th. Who was she and what shaped her early life and calling?
Well, she was an Italian woman, youngest of 13, was born in 1850. Her mother was, I think, in her 50s when she was born, and Francesca was born about 2 months early, which left her kind of frail pretty much her entire life.
Okay.
At the time, they didn't necessarily have ways for babies to catch up like they do now. And she had a sister, her sister Rose, that she was really close to, that she sort of had modeled her own life and holiness after her. And Rose was sort of like a second mother to her. And she had this habit when she was young of playing missionary. And she would imagine herself going on ships and boats, and she would play with the boats. And then one time she actually fell into the river and appeared to have drowned. Her sister found her sort of laying on the shore, not alive. And when she went back, she found out that somebody had removed her from the water and didn't know who it was. And Francesca was pretty mum about this happening, but it's clearly something miraculous with her guardian angel, who she had a pretty strong devotion to. But what it did to her is made her deathly afraid of water, which is ironic,
yes.
Right? Because she probably crossed the Atlantic like 20 times.
Oh my gosh.
And she would, it was very funny. She would go anywhere if it was for a missionary reason, but if they wanted her to get on a boat for anything else, she wouldn't get on. Which I guess makes sense. And so she, a pretty pious child. And then when she's about 7, she's confirmed, and she has some sort of mystical experience when she's confirmed. And she, again, sort of mum on exactly what happened, but she had this mystical experience where she kind of felt she was no longer on earth, and she was filled with this joy, but also this zeal for the Holy Ghost. And I think that was sort of what animated her, the whole rest of her sort of life, because all she ever wanted to do was be a missionary.
How did that first get introduced to her, being a missionary? Is there a particular...
I think it was on her mind, right? So, obviously her patron was St. Francis Xavier. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was always just something kind of before her, who is, one of the patron saints of missionaries. And she just, again, I think probably had something to do that. There's a beautiful part of the confirmation. We sort of don't always treat it like it's supposed to be, like it's supposed to arm us for evangelization, right? And so, and often we treat it as, kids are becoming adults for the faith or what, but no, it's like, the whole purpose of it is to arm us, because now we're entering the spiritual battle of spreading the faith, right? And to see it like manifest itself in the lives of the saints, and especially in her life, is actually really cool to see.
So her devotion to the Holy Spirit and that strengthening her, you think that had a big part of
it seems from vocation. What she said. Unfortunately, she burned most of her writings before she died.
I remember reading that.
Yeah, a lot of saints will do that. And so you don't necessarily know that much about her interior life other than what other people could kind of see or hear, or she may have told them in passing.
Rob, I think I appreciate that, though, because I think that when we do have spiritual writings of someone, the focus is on them. It's not necessarily on our own relationship with the Lord. So it shifts a little bit. Maybe, I don't know, if they're writing about how important it is to stay focused on Christ and his church and the Eucharist, okay. But if it's too much about
do you keep a prayer journal?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Are you able to, a lot of times people will write in it thinking someone else is going to read it later,
yes,
right?
Yes, exactly. That's the focus of it.
Yeah,
that's
so
such a great point.
Yeah, so I think I can totally, and I'm picking on you, but I do it too. But I could totally relate to that then. I'm like, that one of the ways to protect yourself from that, so that, you use the journal for what you're trying to kind of keep track of what's going on interiorly, right?
Well, and let's shift gears a little bit then, because I want to focus on this. What should our intention be when we're keeping a prayer journal then? So it's not so much as if it's a letter to some mysterious person that might be reading it later. What are we supposed to do?
Yeah, I think the way I use it personally is I just jot in it,
where you are.
Well, something that moved me, right, during my prayer time. And then, very strangely, I will come back to it. And usually I will come back to it so on my Sunday evenings, I will do what's called a repetition. This is a very, very St. Ignatius way to do it. Mm-hmm. And what I'll do is I'll look back over the past week and then look back over the past month. And very often I'll find a lot of dots connected.
Oh, my gosh.
Because it just, especially for lay people, prayer can be a little bit disconnected. Mm-hmm. And so and that has helped me actually, because now I'm just jotting in there the things that I understand, and I'm not worried about somebody else reading it, right? It looks disjointed, but I know what it means, and surprisingly, when I go back to it, and then the other thing I'm really careful about is I usually do it at the end of my prayer time, not during, because just like you and I were talking, right? Like if we were to stop talking and I'm like watching you write, like the whole tenor of the conversation changes, right?
Yes.
So for me, it helps a lot more just to wait till the end. And I don't worry about forgetting anything, because if God wants me to remember, I'll remember.
Such a great point.
Yeah. And so it's mostly just a tool by which, I'm able to sort of just go, okay, like what has been stirring in me? Why did this move me? What does this passage move me to think about? And I found it pretty fruitful. It's usually not day to day, but if I go back and look, especially the repetition, I go back and look, it helps a ton.
You can see how God's hand is working in your life.
Yeah. Because,
tangibly.
Again, always so subtle, and just, he just does it gradually, right? And I don't always, I pray early in the morning, and so like my day gets going, and sometimes I don't always, think about, okay, well, this actually connects back to what God was talking to me about this morning, right? But, if I just write down, a few sentences or so, they're almost always, I'll begin to see the hand of providence working, kind of just confirming my prayer or building on it or whatever.
So great. All right. So we started this because we were talking about Mother Cabrini and burning her writings.
Burning her writings, yeah.
But no, we don't need to do that, but we'll stay focused on our own writings. So she had a devotion to St. Francis Xavier, and that kind of led her into this missionary spirit that she had. And then with the Holy Spirit and the strength that we get from the Holy Spirit in its fullness, really, at confirmation, just really calling on that, I think, is important. But with her health, she was so frail. How did that affect her getting into a religious community?
Yeah, I mean, so she thought it was not an obstacle at all. I mean, most people thought her energy was boundless. And, she was quite sick. But she was educated by the Daughters of the Sacred Heart. So she kind of just assumed that they would take her, which is a little strange because they're not a missionary order, right? And in fact, at the time, there really wasn't a missionary order of women. And so she was actually pretty disappointed when they didn't take her. And she actually, I think, ended up applying twice. But yeah, so, she ends up, the parish priest asked her if she would go teach at a school because the teacher there was out. I think she had smallpox or something. And, the other teacher really needed the job. And so she asked if Francesca would actually just teach and kind of fill in for her. And I think she ended up filling in for her for like 2 years. And then eventually the teacher comes back and she applies again to the Daughters of the Sacred Heart, and they reject her again, not because of her piety, but they just thought she was too frail. And so then she, there was a Monsignor who then asked her if she would go work, if she would go work in an orphanage that had been poorly run. Her initial sort of response was, no, this is not the action of a missionary. But she had decided that the way to get to where she wanted to be was to obey. Like that was her path, right? Obedience was her path. And so because someone in the church asked her, she said yes.
Isn't obedience always the way, Rob?
Yeah. I mean, 100%, right? Like it's, but for her, it was, she initially, because she was so frail, that was her way of practicing asceticism, was, to be diligent in small things and to always obey. And she thought that was enough. She didn't worry about doing all these austere penances because she, probably would have ended up killing herself. But so she ends up going to this House of Providence orphanage, and she eventually ends up being the superior there. When she takes her vows with, I think, 7 other women, the 7 other women give, their vows to her. And that sort of starts her sort of path to starting that, her religious order.
Her own religious order.
Yeah.
Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Okay, so what led her to come to the United States? There was some discussion about, or some research I came across that was about a choice between coming to the U.S. or going to China. And how did she...
Yeah, in her own mind, she wanted, China was the place for whatever reason.
St. Francis Xavier.
Yeah, I think. So China was the place. And initially, she's actually kind of frustrated because she seems like she's just stuck, right? And she's not going in the direction that, she wants to go. She wants to go to China, and she's like, okay, if I go to this orphanage and I'm, now stuck with these 7 sisters, how am I going to end up in China? But she just kind of keeps plugging along and letting God do his thing, right? So, it's like very, almost in a biblical sense, like Nehemiah, where, it seems to be that he has no chance to get back to Jerusalem to build the city. And then all of a sudden God just opens his path, and he's been forming him all along, right? And so, she was being formed all along to be a teacher, and God needed her to be a good teacher. And so, she ends up wanting to go east to China. She goes eventually to Rome to ask the permission of the Holy Father. And he told her basically, I don't want you to go to China. I want you to go to the United States. And that was mostly because at the time, the Pope Leo XIII, he was, I think he was he's from Italy, obviously, like all the popes at that time. But he was watching how just horribly the Italians were being treated in the United States. And they were falling away from the faith because of it. And so he said, I need you to go to the United States. And And so, Leo says, don't go east, go to the United States. And again, she obediently follows his command. And she, because of that, she also felt that God had blessed it because the Pope said it. Mm-hmm. And so she would go anywhere. She would go even places the police wouldn't go. That was, that was pretty much how she ended up in the United States.
I think we talk about this quite a bit with our reflection on the various saints and how they desire something so much, but then there's a time of waiting, and that time of waiting is really our Lord forming us for the next major step, and just trusting in His timing and not in our timing. And
it's always, it's with all things, but especially, with apostolic things, like you have to give God the freedom to answer prayers the way He wants to answer them. Not the way you imagine it all playing out, right? And, we all sort of do that. And we think, well, God, you don't have this many people offering. Like, why aren't you taking me up on this, right? And all along, He's like, yeah, I am. But if I tell you the whole story, you're going to mess it up. And I need you to learn how to do this, or I need you to be able to do this before that happens, right? And
I wanted to interject about the movie Mother Cabrini. We talked about this previously, that I think it does an okay job reflecting on her life and her struggles. Maybe, of course, it seems to be more gray than it needs to be, but there's not enough emphasis on her devotion to the Eucharist, as with a lot of these things. So it's a good kind of historical rendition of her life. Would you agree?
Yeah, I feel like you walk away from that movie. I was pretty excited to see it, but I remember being disappointed because it seemed more like she was an activist than an apostle, right? And that was, pretty disappointing. I think I've reflected on it since then, and I think part of the reason why, because there's very little emphasis on her interior life at all, right? It just seems like she's a strong-willed woman who, ends up getting this business acumen, and she becomes savvy, and she's like a typical like Italian grandmother who just keeps pushing, and she was all of those things, right? But all of it came, out of a deep, deep interior life and love for Christ.
Okay, so how long she came over New York?
Yeah,
and was a pretty powerful force for good in that area. And some of the images that are popping into my head are coming from that movie, and what she's done and who she's encountering. There's some leaders in the church that really didn't want her doing what she was doing. So they, it's almost like, how can I say this? In me, it kind of pushes me, especially if I know that I feel like I'm being called to do something, just to grow stronger in that desire.
Yeah, I think, well, some of that I can sort of speak to that. I think it's part of the Italian spirit.
Yes, right.
Is I like opposition. Like it, like it's strong-willed, and I'll push right back against it. And so I think in her case, that was exactly it. I don't know what it is in us Italians, but for sure, the more opposition she had, like the more she'd kind of double down. Especially since she knew that this is what the Lord was calling her. And that's, once that was what she had decided. She was very sure that God wanted this. And then she acted like it. Pretty much everything she did, she expected God to just, sort of, for Him to act. She called herself, which is pretty interesting. She called herself not a cooperator with God. She's very, very specific about this, but a witness to His omnipotence. That's how she saw herself.
Wow.
Because she would see these just amazing things that God did. And, so she is, which is beautiful, right? She's in awe of what God's doing, with her around, just like everybody else is, which is, it takes a lot of humility, obviously. But it's a beautiful way to look at things when you just step back and you're amazed by what God is doing around you, and you just happen to be like almost spectating to it, right?
Oh, well, that coincides so beautifully, Rob, with what you were saying about your journal, your spiritual journal, and on Sundays, and then, once a month, and looking back and seeing God's hand in everything that you're doing. So, wow, that's here's the theme for this one. All right. So what qualities made her such a powerful force for good? What would you say? Some things that we can emulate when we're asking for her intercession.
Yeah. Well, I think that reliance on God, that trust,
yes,
she would always overcommit herself. knowing that God would deliver, right? So God would give her a mandate, and she knew, okay, well, anything God commands, he gives the grace. And so she would expect it to happen. In fact, a lot of her miracles during her life were simple things where she needed something. Like, the sisters would say, we're out of bread. And she would stand there for a second and pray, and she'd go, are you sure you looked in the drawer? And they would go back to the drawer and their bread would be in there. And it happened over and over and over. They would, she'd need money or something. And she would drive them nuts because she'd say, are you sure you look thoroughly? And they'd go back and look in the drawer and they knew, that she had done that. And that's the kind of thing, like she would constantly overcommit to things because, she knew she was doing what God wanted and he was not going to disappoint. And, that's obviously what we, when we start to really think about things like be bold, right? Be bold. And expect God to deliver. And then, by then she was so confident, that she just did amazing things. And, in the end, I think, she didn't go to China, but her sisters ended up there, right? So she ends up, the amazing thing is she ended up, pretty much the Americas. And, all of that was like one day she was sitting there and she noticed, she was watching people come in and out of Ellis Island, and about 200,000 like Italians were coming in and out of there. And she goes, well, the Pope told me to go minister to the Italians. Where are they all going? And she would follow them. Because she's like, well, that's part of my mission. And, that's how she ends up, in Chicago, Los Angeles, but also in South America. And, she's just following, she's like, oh, well, I've been given that mandate. I can do that.
Where the Italians are going. Yeah. Wow. She's all over the place.
Yeah.
And it's because she didn't say no. She just kept trusting in God's providence and everything. All right. One more thing about her. And of course, we're going over again with the first Mother Cabrini. What lessons can we take from her faith and trust in God's plan?
Yeah, I think there's a beauty in the way that she actually brought out the best in people, because what she would often do is she would go to a benefactor, and the person could even be hostile to the church, and she would bring out generosity in people, right? So it's almost like she, because she was so generous, she carried around and distributed God's grace of generosity. And it was a beautiful witness to people because she would end up, people who had pretty much, like one time she talked the Italian parliament into giving her money to build something in the United States. Like, I mean, how do you do that except for the fact that there's a grace of, when you're a generous spirit, they're going to look at her and go, like, this little old woman is doing this. Like, how can I say no?
Well, and that's it. I mean, I've encountered people, and really just recently, when you're looking at them, their humility just exudes from them, and you want to help them. You have this desire to just give and give and give. So I totally get that. And got a lot of work in that area. All right. Wow. Okay, Mother Cabrini, please pray for us. Okay, Saint Elizabeth of Hungary is next. Her feast day is November 17th. She's a powerhouse, and she's got some writings, or what is it? And I didn't put this in my questions for you, so it might be something that's kind of throwing you off here. There's something that she's written about with prayers, specific prayers that can really draw. What is it?
Yeah, I think it's actually a journal.
Oh, that's funny.
After we were talking about it. Yeah, so I think there were letters and journals that she had left behind with her prayer in it.
That's it. Yeah. So you can certainly find that on the web, St. Elizabeth of Hungary and her prayer journals, and just deep reflection there. Okay. What was unique about her life as a royal?
What really starting kind of most unique was, if you look at her family tree, there are saints all over it. She has an aunt, Saint Hedwig, who is a saint. She has a first cousin, Agnes of Bohemia. She has a niece, St. Elizabeth of Portugal. Her daughter is a blessed. So there's just sanctity, just, exuding out of this family. So she had all of this around her, sort of growing up, and then, it just became, before we went on air, we were talking about the normality of holiness, right? So holiness was very normal for her. And so she, she's born at the beginning of the 13th century. and she spends her first 4 years in the Hungarian court with her family, and then goes off to Germany because she's going to be betrothed to a prince there, Prince Ludwig, who is about 6 years older than her. And then there's a lot of royal intrigue. Her mom is murdered, but she's always very pious. She'd play games with her friends, and they'd play hide and go seek, and she'd go sneak into the chapel, and they'd find her later praying in the chapel. And they didn't necessarily, at least in the German court, they didn't necessarily like her.
Was it because of her piety?
I think it was mostly, I think initially, just the idea that they had to take care of her, and I think after the reason that they didn't like her is because she kept giving stuff away, and they weren't happy
creature
about
comforts.
That. Yes, yeah. So they were all, she, early on she's persecuted, but mostly in small ways. I mean, they would laugh at her. Be cruel to her. And, she had this way about her, though, when someone was laughing at her or cruel to her, she would just giggle and just laugh it off. Never confrontational. And so, her ladies in waiting is pretty much who they used, for witness when, for her canonization. And they were just saying how she just always exuded joy, even when someone was cruel to her. And so that was, how she, I guess maybe it was how she coped with it. But, you can imagine that, she kept everything sort of in a heavenly perspective, and, didn't see any reason to respond.
I really like, and I just feel the need to share this right now, that you do your research through the writings of the popes as they're doing the canonizations of these saints. So it's, we might be talking about them casually, but this is documented.
Yeah.
If you're just tuning in, this is Ellen White with FaithWorks on Divine Mercy Radio. And today I'm speaking with Rob Agnelli about the lives of three incredible saints we celebrate in November: Mother Cabrini, Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, and Saint Clement of Rome. We're exploring their lives, personal virtues, and the lasting impact they've had on the church and the world. We are grateful for our show's sponsor, Thales College. Okay, back to Saint Elizabeth of Hungary. Her marriage reflected her deep faith. How would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it really reflected the deep faith of both her and her husband. I mean, by all accounts, they have this beautiful marriage. There were folk songs written after he died. He died, I think it was probably like 7 years into their marriage. He went off to the Sixth Crusade, caught a fever, and died. And it broke her heart. She truly loved him. And, by all accounts, he was a good man, a man pursuing holiness. I think what, is at least sort of remarkable about them is it's very clear that they're living like a truly sacramental marriage, in the sense that they are pushing each other towards holiness. It's not just her, it's him too. They would support and sacrifice for each other. He gave her pretty much free rein to do works of mercy, and would defend her. Like we talked about her family, his family not being happy about that. He just said everything was fair game except the castle itself, because he knew that was her path. It was what was on her heart, but it was also a path to her sanctity, right? And so he would, he would support her, and she would kind of spur him on in holiness. So I think in that way, there's just such a clear witness of how faith and love of God, within the sacrament of marriage, the sacrament of marriage, it's a sacrament, right? And so when lived well, the spouses sanctify each other, and you see it completely and totally going on with the two of them.
And Grace, and this might be a good point to say that a friend of mine had recommended a couple of years ago that I offer a holy hour regularly for my husband. And she handed me a little booklet and some prayers that she just kind of put together. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is so beautiful. And, 9 times out of 10, when I am heading to adoration to offer it for my husband, there are so many thoughts that are popping in my head as to why I shouldn't be doing this.
Of course.
So it's a great practice to do for your husband, and I highly recommend it.
Yeah, but even, I think we sometimes overlook this, right? Like, even acts of service within marriage are sanctifying.
Yes.
Not just you, but like as a recipient, right? So, you don't cease to be the minister of marriage on your wedding day. It's all the way through. And so all the graces that you need to get to heaven are there through the sacrament of marriage. And I think, we forget that. And that's why someone like Elizabeth of Hungary is really important, because she clearly leveraged those in a good way, and her husband too.
Besides acts of service in her marriage, what stands out about her charitable work? What would you say?
Yeah, I would say just her, she diligently practiced the works of mercy. She would, anyone who knocked on her door, she would give them, whatever they needed. She also was deeply inspired by St. Francis, so, contemporary with him. And especially his love for lepers. She would minister to lepers pretty regularly. And, in fact, even when her husband died, she ended up, when they kind of threw her out of the castle, she ended up becoming a third order Franciscan. So like her spirituality is deeply rooted in, works of mercy as a source of evangelization. And that's what she would do. She would go about, preaching Christ to the poor and the needy, by laying her life down for them.
And she ultimately gave up the luxury and lived simply, like you said, when they kicked her out of the castle. Yeah. Like that you said that her husband said, everything is fair game except for the castle. You can't do anything with this. She also
would pray for people pretty regularly, and they would have this experience of getting hot, like to the touch.
Oh, interesting.
And there's several accounts of, she was praying for this one man for his conversion, and he's like, she's in another room, and he kind of dismissed her at first, like, oh, okay, go pray for me. And she did. And he has to go find her to tell her to stop, because it's, he's practically burning up. And so she would have this, this deep prayer for someone that they would, it would be palpable in them.
Okay, one final question. There's a story of Miracle of Roses. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, you'll often see her depicted in artwork as having some like roses either tucked in the hem of her dress or in her cloak. So this comes from a story, while Elizabeth was on her way to serve the poor, and she had a bunch of bread tucked away in her dress, and her husband asked her like what she was carrying, and she opens it up, and instead of bread, it's full of these sort of magnificent roses.
Makes me think of the little flower too.
Yeah.
Maybe we can ask for her intercession and for a little dose of roses in her life and see how they show up. I don't want to miss this, though. This is such a great question. So why is she such a powerful witness for us still today? What would you say?
Yeah, I think the answer goes back to the married saints.
Yeah.
Married saints are, really, really important, especially now. I think we're living in a sort of a unique age where God is calling the laity to really double down and help solidify the church. And so we need married saints as models. There's plenty of unmarried saints models, but I think when you find married saints, especially when you see both of them pursuing holiness, cooperating with each other, but it also reminds us, right, of like what the whole purpose of marriage in a certain sense is, right? And what it points to is it points to the communion of saints, right? And so I think, it's a reminder of our destiny, but also the fact that for most of us, like marriage is the means by which God is going to sanctify us. And both of the spouses, and not to see it sort of as a secondary vocation.
Yeah, it'd be such a great little sign to put on the bathroom mirror, right? Just as a daily reminder. Or maybe, how some people put Jesus married JMJ on the top of their paper before they write. Maybe that's something that we can write as married men and women, just as a daily reminder of our own path to sanctification and how it is with our spouse. All right. Shifting gears a little bit. Saint Clement of Rome, and his feast day is November 23rd. Who was he, and how close was he to the apostles? Pretty close.
Yeah. So he ends up being, I think, the fourth pope after Peter, Linus, and Peter, Linus, Cletus. Sorry, I'm thinking like the Roman Catholic.
Clement.
So he is the fourth. He reigns probably starting around the year 92 until about 101. So, 9 years. We don't know exactly when he was born, but probably around the year 30. We don't necessarily know much about his sort of pre-conversion life other than it seems like based on his writings that he was a Gentile because of the way he uses baptizes pagan myths. And then he is ordained by St. Peter and very clearly deserves the title of apostolic father. He knows St. Peter and Paul. In fact, St. Irenaeus talks about him having the preaching of the apostles still echoing in his ears. What's interesting about him, and I think this is like a beautiful sort of thing to think about, is he is the only saint I know of that was canonized before he died. Because in Philippians 4:3, Paul says Clement, who most people think is who he's talking about, his name is written in the book of life. It's clearly a really holy, a holy man, right?
Yes.
So the book of life is where we all want to be.
Exactly.
The church fathers all sort of agree that Clement that Paul's talking about in Philippians 4:3 is the fourth pope.
I'm curious. What do you think the numbers are of Christians during this time? Could you guess?
Somebody has sort of worked it out. It's clearly in, probably the tens of thousands. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But you can sort of get a grasp kind of just, by connecting the dots. And it tends to be in fits and starts. So like he starts his papacy, during, a pretty strong persecution with Domitian, mm-hmm. ends his papacy. In fact, he died, under another persecution. And that seems to be really when the church early on really grows.
Well, that kind of tells me that we've been persecuted since the beginning.
It's the default position, right? Like we've talked about before.
Yes, exactly. All right. So you talk about this persecution. What kinds of challenges did the church face during his leadership?
Yeah,
what would you say specifically?
Sort of two waves of persecutions. And then the second, which we actually have a letter that he wrote to the Corinthian church, there was this potential schism in Corinth where what he called a few sort of headstrong people were trying to run the priests and the bishops out of town and kind of take over the church.
The church is divided. There's division under Roman persecution. He was called to maintain unity and apostolic authority during this time frame. And like you said, this is something that's happened since the beginning of time. Why is his letter to the Corinthians so important?
Yeah, so I think we've talked about the church fathers before, just the necessity of, in a certain sense, it aids the credibility of the church when you look back historically and go, hey, look, like in the year 96, which was about when we think it was written, like, oh, look, there's a pope. And look, he's exercising authority. And oh, look, he's talking about the hierarchy of the church, right?
And oh, look, he's talking about the Eucharist.
Yeah, and that too, right? So he's talking about the liturgy. He's talking about how, the need to see the church as sacramental, not political, right? Because that's what they're trying to do. They're sort of trying to overthrow. It's clear that, he is exercising papal primacy very early on. So he knew it was his responsibility to write. In fact, he apologizes at the very beginning for not writing sooner because what he calls the calamitous events, the persecution that was going on. And so it's very clear that he sees it as his authority. And it's very clear that the Corinthians take it as his authority, right? Because, you look even almost 100 years later, the Corinthians are still reading the letter and the church is still strong. And then I think the other thing that sort of really is convincing is, Corinth is not that far from Ephesus, where John the Apostle was, right? So you would think, right, John the Apostle would take care of it, but John the Apostle, in a certain sense, defers to Peter, right? And so it's very hard to sort of dispute the fact that there was a clear exercising of the authority, right? And, even in the letter, he, at a certain point, essentially repeats the "he who hears you hears me" to them, saying like, Christ is speaking and he's speaking through me. And then the other thing too, like if you read it carefully, like you mentioned already, the liturgy and the Eucharist is there, but also just he lays out the orderliness apostolic succession and the church and the structure of the church and just why it's necessary.
Wow, direct line to our first pope. Okay, how did he show wisdom and humility as a leader? I think these two qualities are so important in good leadership, and I was really impressed.
Yeah, I think it becomes very clear in his letter that he's sort of animated by these. It's just the way he speaks, and you can also see this echo of St. Paul in him. So you can tell who formed him because he has this it's very clear what he keeps sort of telling the Corinthians is Christ did this, so now you should do the same thing, right? And so he talks about Christ's humility. He talks about Christ's wisdom, and he sort of sees Christ as this sort of third tablet of the commandments, right? His life, and so it's clear that he's exhorting them to exercise humility in accepting the authority that's there because he himself is a humble man.
Mm-hmm. And I love you talk a lot about clarity. He was very clear.
Yeah.
And what he was saying. And it's so important to be clear when you're leading. He also, I know, defended tradition while calling for reconciliation, which I think is...
Yeah, and he says the solution is charity, right? Mm-hmm. So just a beautiful, he's like charity, charity creates unity. He's like, so when there's no love, there will be no unity.
Yes. My mind is starting to go off on a little tangent with the homily that was at Daily Mass today was about, rule followers and being too rigid in following the rules and foregoing charity. And we can't do that.
No.
We need to be charitable. All right. So what do we know about his martyrdom? He was martyred.
Yeah. So he was arrested by Trajan, the Emperor Trajan, during one of the persecutions, and then he's exiled. And he's forced to work in a stone quarry. And
how old is he at this time?
He's probably in his 70s, maybe close to 80. He's still being the shepherd, though. So there's a lot of Christians there with him. They're starving and dehydrated. He's still ministering to them. He's still advocating for them. At one point, he struck the ground with an axe and water came out because they were dehydrated. And it leads to the conversion of, not only prisoners, the other prisoners, but also, some of the Roman soldiers. Eventually gets back to the emperor and he puts an anchor around his neck and throws him into the Black Sea. And if you recall, when we did Cyril and Methodius, remember Cyril found his remains and brought them to Rome to the Church of St. Clement. So and that's why you see his sort of symbol is often the anchor, because that's how he met his end.
But it's also a symbol of hope and steadfast faith, which is so ironic.
Exactly.
I love that.
Yeah, he didn't sink, he rose, right?
Oh, exactly. Yeah. It's not the end, it's the beginning.
Yep.
What lasting influence did he have on the church and unity and leadership today? What would you say?
I would say, like Benedict XVI, in his sort of his Wednesday audiences on the Church Fathers, mentions how, this is really the first exercise of Roman primacy after Peter's death, but it also ends up being a template of how authority is supposed to be exercised, right? Like we already said, sort of that the charity, charity trumps all, and charity had to be the cause of the unity, and the visible hierarchy was the sign, right? So again, what unites us is, that we are a body, and not a body in the organizational sense, but in the organism sense, right? And so I think he sort of lays that framework, and then you see, going forward, that's pretty much how the popes exercise their authority.
And he's, which I think sometimes there's a little bit of humor with what these saints are patrons of. And he's a patron of mariners with the anchor.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, well, in the end, why not laugh it off?
Exactly.
Right?
That's right.
Yeah, I'm sure he held no grudges. Right.
Right, and he's kind of laughing right now. And peacemakers in the church and writers. Okay, any kind of final thoughts or any saints that really left an impact with this month's saints, Rob, that you would say or like to finish
I would still go back to Elizabeth of Hungary and just the spurring on of your spouse. And every morning getting up and, like your idea of writing on the mirror, right? Every morning getting up and going, how much closer am I getting Allison to heaven? And, asking God to use me in that way.
Not thinking about where we are lacking.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay. As we wrap up today's episode of Saints in the Making, we've seen how God works through very different lives, a missionary nun, a royal mother, and a first century pope to build his church and serve his people. Mother Cabrini reminds us to go where we're needed, not just where we are comfortable. Saint Elizabeth of Hungary challenges us to serve with humility and generosity, no matter our status. And Saint Clement of Rome encourages us to be peacemakers and leaders grounded in truth and tradition. So here's our challenge for the week, and I'm taking it myself too. Choose one small act of faith, charity, or leadership that stretches you beyond your comfort zone. Maybe it's reaching out to someone who feels alone, volunteering your time, or stepping up in your parish or family when it's easier to step back. The saints didn't set out to be famous. They set out to be faithful, and so can we. A heartfelt thank you, Rob, yet again. You not only shared such thoughtful and inspiring insights today, but it's clear how much time and care you put into getting to know each saint. We're grateful for the depth you bring to these conversations. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on past conversations filled with inspiration and hope, you can find them all at divinemercyradio.org. Just click on local shows. And don't forget, you can take FaithWorks with you wherever you go. Just download the free Divine Mercy Radio app from your app store. Simply search Divine Mercy Radio and see, and you're all set to listen anytime, anywhere. God bless.